6 years ago, my husband died in a car crash. I remember like it was yesterday. The screaming of the metal as it tore apart, the dull puff of the airbag. I even remember that he had just pulled the handle back for the windshield washing fluid. It was still dripping off the wiper on my side. I don't remember much after the actual crash. The doctors say that's normal. I suffered a pretty severe concussion and sprained a bunch of things. There was some trauma to my left hand, but it was fixed before I woke up, and I broke some bones in my foot. They say the hit to my noggin was bad enough I should have cracked my skull, but didn't. Small miracle, right? They didn't tell me for almost a day that Dan hadn't made it. I was regulated to my hospital room, some sitcom playing quietly, when a nurse and a doctor I hadn't seen before entered. There was no other way to put it. I felt like a part of my soul had been pulled away from me. Dan was my everything. We were rarely apart aside from work, and the occasional late shift one or the other of us would have to pull. That's why, when after the doctors had left, and a man had walked into my room to offer me Dan back, I didn't bother listening to the rest of what he said. I just said yes, sitting as far up in bed as I could, careful of the IV they had in to make sure I was getting enough fluids. I know. Margaret, why did you say yes? Didn't you know you were signing away your soul? Except I wasn't. He chuckled when I responded so eagerly. Don't you want to know the catch? He had laughed. It doesn't matter, so long as I have Dan, I had replied. And so he had smiled, his long fingers resting against my hand. When I looked down, my wedding band was gone. Anger had rushed through me, and I tensed, but before I could get a word out, he nodded towards the bedside table. My ring lay in plain view, and I couldn't remember if I'd been wearing it in the beginning or not. Then my head began to hurt, pounding with the worst migraine I'd ever had, and I clenched my eyes shut, my good hand fumbling for the nurse call button. I don't remember the nurse getting to me. I have no memories of the code blue they called, or the next 15 minutes of my life. The next thing I remember is pressure of wetness on my right hand as nurses filed out of the room. Dan sat beside me, tears spilling from his eyes as he pressed the back of my hand to his lips. He was murmuring against it, and it took me a moment for my senses to collect enough for me to realize he was praying that I was okay. Did Dan? I asked. I felt as weak as a kitten, but he raised his head and saw his blue eyes. I started bawling. The hug was awkward as he twisted over the bed, but we held it for what felt like hours. Eventually we separated, and he told me he thought he'd lost me, that the truck had flipped and I was pinned underneath of it. I didn't remember any of that, but I didn't care. Dan was with me, and if that meant I had lost part of my memories, I would just make new ones. I had him, and that's what mattered. I was discharged a few days later, my foot in a cast and a bandage on my head. They told me I would likely always have pain in my hand because of the potential for nerve damage. I didn't care. I didn't care when they told me I had actually lost my pinky and ring fingers and that they had to be attached. None of it mattered. Dan drove us to a popular restaurant in our hometown and asked me to wait while he got us both a big dinner. I smiled and agreed. The weather was nice and I could sit with the windows down. It was nice to be out of the hospital, and he knew what I liked from here. We ate when we got home. The food was just as good as I remembered. He didn't let me out of his sight that night. I fell asleep with his arms tangled around me, my wedding ring on a necklace he had given me and nested against my chest. A beeping sound woke me up a couple times, but I couldn't place where it was coming from. It sounded similar to the alarm on his phone, and that was in the other room. I shrugged as he stirred and took the medicine he handed me the second time it happened. It took 6 months before I felt confident enough to return to work. Dan had returned about a month prior, coming off of his FMLA leave. My coworkers loved having me back. I fell into my old routine easily, coming home to meet Dan each night only to be greeted with a kiss and a hug every time. I was happy, truly and completely happy. The next 5 years of our life were some of the best we'd ever had. We got a new car, got a dog. We even talked about having a kid, but decided not to. I got promoted and he did too, and our finances had never been better. Then, a few months ago, I started waking up in the middle of the night. I could hear beeping. It wasn't there all the time, only in the quiet moments. It got louder as time passed, and I sought help, getting sent eventually to an ear, nose, and throat specialist named Dr. Duclair. He had diagnosed me with tinnitus and said it was probably due to damage sustained back in the accident that had only gotten worse with the passage of time. There was nothing to be done, he said. Avoid stressors, avoid alcohol, try listening to white noise or one of the other colors to see if that would help. I nodded like I understood. He told me to do everything I could to protect my hearing. I nodded again. He stressed that I needed to. This could only get worse. He was right. Thankfully, Dan was there for me. When the beeping got too loud or lasted for too long, he would run the shower and hold me to help drown it out. He would grab a set of headphones and play some white noise for me to distract me from it. But the beeping eventually got too loud to be distracted from, and I went back to Dr. Duclair. He told me there was no cure for tinnitus, that all we could do was wait and see what would happen. I was heartbroken. I took leave from work, and Dan offered to do it as well, but I told him not to. We couldn't both do that. Our finances were good, but not that good. I spent the days with our dog Echo at my side. I had a radio playing in each room, but I could still hear the beeping, and occasionally I would suffer from auditory hallucinations of voices. I never could understand what they were saying, but occasionally I could think I heard Dan's voice calling my name. It was when I stopped on the steps, thinking that I heard it. Echo didn't, and I fell. 3 weeks ago I woke up in the hospital, sore and hurting, and alone. I tried to reach the call button, but could barely lift my arm or even turn my head as the door to my room flew open. The nurse hit what I could barely remember registering as a panic button above my bed the last time I was in the hospital, and the room filled with people. It was only as she pulled a tube from my throat and moved to remove the bindings on my wrists that I realized something terrible must have happened. Doctors asked if I remembered what had happened. Nurses took my vitals. My throat was sore, and I could barely speak. But as soon as there was a brief lull, I asked for Dan. I will never forget the looks that passed amongst the staff. I will never forget the way the doctor cleared his throat, or the sudden nervousness he showed. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Peterson, but Mr. Sawyer will not be attending. We will inform him that you woke, of course, but, well, I'm sorry, but I'll have to let his lawyer and yours discuss the situation." I was shocked as people filed out of my room. 6 years ago, we were in an accident. 6 years ago, I entered a coma, the lawyers claimed. Dan had superficial injuries, but I had suffered some severe brain trauma. Dan had waited 5 years before he started to look at divorce proceedings, at which time I was assigned a lawyer to help evenly distribute my half of our estate. They rebuked my claims of the last 6 years of my life. The only thing that seemed to be true from my memories is that my pinky and ring finger had to be reattached. They left after what felt like hours, and I was alone again in my room until he walked in. I recognized him at once. The slick smile, the small pointed mustache that didn't quite meet under his nose. Before I could speak, he held up his hand to silence me. "You're missing this, yes?" he asked me as he held up my wedding ring. I fumed, clenching my teeth. He smirked as he waited for my response, and finally I gave a short nod, the long-healed wounds of my fingers aching. "It's a shame he's given it to someone else already." Like a magician, he snapped his fingers, and the ring disappeared. "Such a shame that it's the person that caused your accident. Wouldn't you say that?" My eyes grew wide, the pain in my fingers almost forgotten as he leaned close. "Mrs. Peterson it is now. I hear. Divorced while you slept." "What are you talking about?" I demanded. "Dan would never leave me." His grin grew as he laid a sheet of paper on my lap, and my hands trembled as I struggled to unfold it. A copy of a wedding license, Dan's name on it, and a Susan Pendergast. My hand shook so bad I nearly tore it before I felt the tears well up. "I told you I would return him to you," he whispered. "I never said for how long." 6 days ago, my husband died in a car crash. I'm sorry, it was my ex-husband and his wife. I'll be sitting at the reading of his will in a few days, though I don't think it's necessary. I have a very good lawyer.